Welcome, everyone. I'm Therèsa Winge. I'm one of Joanne's, or I was one of Joanne's graduate students at the University of Minnesota. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University. My research area is dress from emerging subcultures and pop culture. My last book was an ethnography on cosplay called Costuming Cosplay with Bloomsbury. My current research is focusing on science fiction and dress, as well as some of the protest dress and insurgency dress that's happened recently. I am co-director with Heather Aku for the Dress and Body Association. I want to thank you for joining us today for this oral history with Joanne Eicher. I want to begin by sharing a brief biography of Joanne with you, and then ask her some questions and let her give us some answers. Joanne B. Eicher received her Bachelor of Arts degree in 1952 with a minor in textiles and clothing, a Master of Art in 1957, and a Ph.D. in 1959 in Sociology and Anthropology from Michigan State University. Her first faculty position was at Boston University in 1957, returning in 1961 to Michigan State University, from where she was recruited in 1977 to the University of Minnesota as the department head of textiles and clothing. In 1983, she became the department head of Design, Housing, and Apparel Department at the University of Minnesota, and was also appointed director of the Goldstein Museum. She retired in 2005 as Regents Professor Emerita. At Michigan State, she began her sociocultural research from 1963 to 1966, where she lived in Nigeria, returning to write a book on Nigerian handcraft textiles. After her 1966 visit to the Niger Delta, home of the Kalabari people, she researched their dress and textile practices based on their history and global trade. She collaborated with Tonye V. Erikosima, a Kalabari scholar, in developing cultural authentication as a concept and a theory. Joanne co-edited Dress, Adornment, and the Social Order in 1965 and co-authored The Visible Self in 1973 with Dr. Mary Ellen Roach Higgins. It's been revised thrice and currently is under revision for publication of 2023. During her work with Dr. Roach Higgins, they introduced the concept of dress as a non-biased and inclusive term for body modifications and body supplements. Of note, Mary Ellen Roach Higgins and Joanne Eicher were among some of the first members of the Costume Society of America. In 1987, Joanne Eicher spent her sabbatical at the Center for Cross-Cultural Research for Women at the University of Oxford in England, which led to several books, including Dress and Gender in 1992, Dress and Identity in 1995, and Beads and Bead Makers in 1998. Later books would include Fashion Foundations, Early Writings on Dress in 2003, and Mother, Daughter, Sister, Bride, Rituals of Womanhood for National Geographic in 2005, which you see pictured here. And most recently, an Anthropology of Dress and Fashion, a reader in 2019, which was on our title slide, as well as a 2020 article that will be published in Fashion Theory, Dress, the Senses, and Public, Private, and Secret Selves. Additionally, she is the editor of two-book series, Dress Body Culture, starting in 1994 with 75 titles, and Dress and Fashion Research, starting in 2013 with 10 titles, both at Bloomsbury Publishers. She is also the editor-in-chief of a 10-volume Berg Encyclopedia of Dress and Fashion, published in 2010, that continues today online. Her presentations around the globe include Australia, China, England, India, Italy, Korea, New Zealand, the United States, and she's also traveled for research to Europe, Egypt, Ethiopia, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Dahomey, Mali, and the Republic of Benin. You might think after that introduction there's no more to tell, but there really is. So let's just jump in and talk to Joanne about her history with us. Joanne, I want to start with, when you think back on your career, what motivated you to pursue a career in dress studies, especially given that some of your degrees are not in dress studies?
Well, as a graduate student at Michigan State, I was also, I took courses from Gregory P. Stone, and you see his article that he was very well known for, Appearance in the Self, that first appeared in a book called Human Behavior and the Social Processes by Arnold Rose, but that Mary Ellen Roach Higgins and I reprinted in as one of the selections in Dress, Adornment, and the Social Order that you also commented on. And he had done his work at the University of Chicago, and he was very interested in what he called appearance, later called, he didn't call it dress as much as clothing. When he got to Michigan State, he worked on a team with a social psychologist, with a textiles and clothing scholar then at Michigan State, and they did research in a small community called Coldwater, Michigan, and they were researching the dress practices of husbands and wives. And so I was working with him at the time that they were processing that data. So that really was the beginning of my interest, in doing something academically. I guess that's the short answer.
One of your most significant contributions to dress studies is the concept and theory of dress itself. Can you share with us how Dr. Mary Ellen Roach Higgins and you came to develop this definition and classification? Because today, a lot of us are talking about decolonizing certain disciplines. And it seems like you and Mary Ellen had a sense of that a long time ago.
Well, Mary Ellen and I had been interested working first from the concept of clothing because that's what people were talking about. But she was really a dress historian, and I had gone more into the cultural interests. She also had a graduate student, Kathleen Musa, at the time, and they had been working on the history of dress or history of costume. And we realized, as Mary Ellen and I worked together based on her former work, that we really weren't talking just about clothing. We were talking about dressing the body, all of the things that you do. I often say when you get up in the morning, take a shower, comb your hair, decide to put on cosmetics, perfume, aftershave, whatever. And so it's much more than just putting clothing on. So that really was the beginning of our definition that ended up in the classification of dress as you see it on the left in this slide with a picture of Mary Ellen.
Have you any significant or defining research experiences that you can share with us?
Well, one that comes out most vividly in terms of a lot of my research, was this work with Gregory Stone, and then following it, I started working at Michigan State on clothing as related to role behavior of teenage girls, or an acceptance, actually. And you'll notice in this particular publication that was in what Michigan State published as the quarterly bulletin of the funding agency, the Experiment Station, that we were using clothing there. We weren't using dress. We hadn't quite gotten to that point that Mary Ellen and I had gotten to later. So Stone was the first impetus, really. I translated that into working with high school girls, but then living in Nigeria in the 1960s, after I had arrived back at Michigan State from having taught at Boston University, in Nigeria, my former husband and I went to Nigeria on an assignment that he took as an agricultural economist. And so living in Nigeria for 3 years introduced me to a wide variety of different cultures, because there are 250 linguistic groups, and linguistic groups often connect to how people live culturally, including, of course, their dress. So just before we were to return in 1966, we were invited to the island of Bugama, which is in the mangrove swamps of the Niger River, close to where the Niger River meets the Atlantic. And that visit ended up over time taking me into working in much detail with the Kalabari people.
I first met Joanne when I was an undergrad. I was in my senior year and I was considering graduate school. And I met with Dr. Beverly Gordon, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Many of you probably know who Beverly is. She's a lovely person. And she, after a long, gracious amount of her time with me, she told me that I really needed to go work with Joanne Eicher because I was interested in culture and dress and subcultures and dress, and that she would be the best person to work with. And so I went back to Minnesota, and I was fortunate that Joanne was back from either a research leave or something like that. And she was teaching a class called African Dress. And I was not interested in African dress, but I really wanted to take a class with her and find out what Beverly was talking about. And I took the class, and she very quickly moved us out of a classroom setting into a room where a bunch of chairs were placed in a circle and gave us and had us buy our book before class. And it was this gigantic book that wouldn't fit in my backpack no matter what I did. But after even that first class, the stories, her passion about dress, I was like, I really need to work with this person if I possibly can. And I did everything I could to get in her, to have some FaceTime with her. So eventually, when I came back for my PhD, I was able to work with Joanne. I bring up this story because I got to see this firsthand, is that Joanne's students, her grad students and her undergrads are very important to her and always have been. And I think your grad students in particular, you have a special bond with. And I think they have a special place in your career, especially considering all the collaborations you've done over the years. Could you speak to your role as a graduate mentor and how that's impacted dress studies and even your research?
Sure. The slide you see now, even shows my collaboration with you on a chapter called Theme Weddings as Carnivalesque Events in this title on the left, Wedding Dress Across Cultures, edited by Donald Johnson and Helen Bradley Foster. And on the right, you see again the 10 volumes of the Encyclopedia of World Fashion and Dress. And that's there because you also see that I had graduate students who had finished write essays in the appropriate volumes for that particular project. I like collaboration. I like sharing and developing ideas with others. And Mary Ellen and I particularly enjoyed the the back and forth, the give and take. And I found it similarly exhilarating with graduate students too. So with several of them, I encouraged them to continue on with Kalabari research topics because as I started doing the Kalabari research in depth, I realized that there were many topics that I really couldn't research all by myself. I wouldn't really have enough time. And the same thing had happened prior to that at Michigan State when I did research on teenage girls' dress and social acceptance. And the graduate students continued on that research as well. And as a matter of fact, I was looking at my CV and I realized that several graduate students simultaneously got their master's in 1962 because they were each doing aspects of the research of dress and social acceptance. So that's what this slide is about, is my interest in collaboration and how much I enjoy it.
The Visible Self remains a seminal textbook for teaching cultural dress. You have plans for current revisions. Could you speak to the role of this text in dress studies and the revisions that have happened over the years?
Well, as not as Mary Ellen and I were looking at it, but because Mary Ellen and I had very similar degrees at Michigan State. She got her degree at Michigan State in sociology and anthropology. We had some courses together. We obviously had a cross-cultural view of life experiences, and obviously dress was one of them. And we were put in touch by actually a publisher's representative who suggested that we get together and write a book. And that's how we got the first book that you see down in the lower left, The Visible Self, with the black, white, and red cover. And I think the point at that moment was that we were looking at dress not in fashion, not as haute couture. It was more than haute couture, more than fashion, as many people look at fashion. And we felt so strongly about that it's really hard in the first couple of books on The Visible Self to find the word fashion, because we were pushing the concept that people dress themselves around the world, whether they put on cosmetics, whether they're pierced, whether they're tattooed, or whether they're wearing clothing. So the key to our book is the cultural aspect and looking at everyday dress and at dress for celebrations. Now, important too, in terms of collaborations, two former graduate students here at Minnesota, Hazel Lutz and Sandy Evenson, have been involved as co-authors in the revisions. And currently, Sandy Evenson is now going to be the first named author for the fifth edition coming out in 2023.
What is your current agenda and what is your next project?
Well, my current agenda actually relates to the early experiences in Nigeria. The first one you see on the left. When I came back from Nigeria, I wrote this book, Nigerian Handcrafted Textiles, because I had started collecting handcrafted textiles. I was quite overwhelmed by their beauty and so on. And so that was 1968, 69, whatever the date of publication. But then, as I mentioned, when I visited this Bugama island in the Niger Delta, they gave me a gift of cloth, and that relates to the title that you see on the right, and it relates to the picture that you see of me in the middle that was an opening for this very unusual cloth called Piletevite, Kalabari cut thread cloth, where I discovered something that the Kalabari had done for a long time. Mostly it was women who did it, but who took an Indian Madras textile and they picked up one thread at a time. Here you see one of the real artists of it. Her name is Ammonia Coco, and she's wearing one that's a very finely done one, her wrapper, and then she's holding one up. And the one she's holding up is an Indian Madras, and they take a needle and they take a penknife blade or a razor blade and they pick up one thread at a time, cut it at two ends and pull it out and make designs by subtraction. So in that photograph, you see all of the darker places are where they have removed the light and bright threads. And so the place you see an X and so on, those are with the other threads removed. So that was the beginning of the Kalabari research. On the right, you also see what the Kalabari I found fascinating. about is they had been involved in obviously extensive world trade. How would they get the Indian Madras that I talked about? And how did they get these Indian imported velvets, these Indian velvets with embroidered with metallic threads, silver or gold. And the man dancing on the left is wearing a red velvet robe with gold embroidery, and the woman, his daughter on the right, is dancing with a black velvet embroidered skirt. Well, she's using it as a wrapper, a very short wrapper. And they are dancing at a funeral. He's also carrying a fan, dancing with the fan. And then there's much too long a story about the hat that he's wearing, but it just turned out to be a very fascinating journey of the cultural use of dress and textiles by the Kalabari, and that's really what I'm doing now, and I might say more about that later. I guess what I left off is that book is scheduled for it's called Global Trade, Cultural Authentication, and the Kalabari of the Niger Delta, and it's coming out with Indiana University Press in 2022 with 22 chapters and 80 colored photographs, and most of them are mine. And the chapters include my collaborative publications with the late Dr. Erica Sema and the former grad students' materials who went on to do the research, Kate Daly, Hazel Lutz, Susan Michelman, Manuela Petgrave, Alicia Renee, Otto Thiem, and Susan Torntori. The Kalabari ended up being like a dress scholar's dream in terms of doing cultural research, because I found that not only did they, create this really new textile, that's how we got cultural authentication. They took something, they borrowed it, and then they made it their own by doing this drawn work process. So that's how they culturally authenticated. It's very different than cultural appropriation, because they didn't just take something over. They borrowed something and they made it their own, because we found that Paleti Bete had not been done anyplace else in the world. The closest thing to it is Norwegian Hardinger, and they're removed threads, but they are always, to my knowledge, white fabrics. And then around the small holes that are made by removing threads, they do more embroidery to make them very secure. But the textile that you see on the left that she's holding, that she's cut and drawn the threads, there is nothing to hold the openings in place. They just wear them very carefully. They wear them like we would wear a cocktail dress or an evening dress or something, and then they don't wear them often, is what I'm saying. And instead of sending them to the cleaners, they air them, throw them over a clothesline or something like that. So that was one part of the beginning part of the research. But then when you look at the slide on the right, that was a whole new area. When I went back to find out about the Kalabari research on the text, what the textile was, one woman said to me, "Oh, madam, if you like our textiles, you should see our funerals." And actually, the slide at the right is a shot of the two people dancing at a funeral, and they were celebrating the life of the chief mourner, who was the male, the son of the elderly woman, and then her granddaughter, his daughter. And that took me into several years of research by following their funerals and also following their dress practices. Several of the students that I mentioned to you, Kate Daly and Susan Michelman and Alicia Renee, who did these portions, and Susan Torrentori. If you look carefully, you see on the slide, the woman is wearing extensive coral around her neck. So Susan Torrentori did the research on coral. Alicia Renee did research on the Palette Tibete. Hazel Lutz did the research on the embroidered velvets. Sandy Evenson did research on the Indian Madras. And I don't know right now if I've left somebody out, but it was really quite fun, not only for me to do my part of the research, and much of this, the funeral research and the Palette Tibete and so on, I had begun those by doing my collaboration with Tonya Erica Sima. So it was, as I said, like a dress and textile scholar's dream to find a group that delighted in textiles and developing their own cultural practices of dress.
We have a question from Regina Root. She asked, since we are talking about dress and scholarship, it seems like academic culture can minimize the collaborative. And yet, collaborations clearly make important things happen in the field. How might we as scholars make a case for the collaborative in these studies of world fashion and dress? How does the collaborative hold up a time of merit when we need to show all that we have done and honor these important ideas?
That is really a great question. Part of the answer is difficult because it relates to money. It relates to how do people get credit in academia. And what's happened in the past is when you have collaboration, especially if you have it across departments, then who gets the credit? What department gets the credit? Which scholar gets the credit? You know, does it make a difference who was named first in a article or a book or whatever? So for those of you who are in administration, in departments and so on, you can work with even higher administration to try to figure out how you can find out, was there equal participation? Then, you know, you acknowledge that. It's really quite a critical question because collaboration is quite a yeasty type of process. If you look in the sciences, you know, if you look at some of the interesting developments, even if you look at the Nobel Prizes, frequently there will be not just one person mentioned in the Nobel Prize, but it will be two people. And so at least at the Nobel Prize level, they've been able to figure that out. But it's a tough question, and it's a very important one that we need to figure out. I think one of the things that happened with Mary Ellen Roach, Higgins, and me is the fact that we were in two completely different institutions. And so we weren't, you know, struggling within the same department. It turned out that each of our institutions were able to give us credit. And another thing that happened is that I was very lucky at Michigan State at that time. I can't speak to Michigan State now, but I actually was credited for working on a book, for having published a book. That's not always the way. And for textiles and clothing departments, who have often had their partners in colleges of agriculture, it has been tough because agriculture has often worked on a very strict science approach where you do experiments. And when you do experiments, then you have a lot of publications because you do an experiment and then you have one publication and then you change it and do another experiment, and you have another publication. So when colleges of home economics, where many of our textiles and clothing departments were lodged, when colleges of home economics were in relationship to colleges of agriculture, departments in them weren't as familiar with qualitative research as quantitative research. And so, again, that brings up the whole challenge. I don't like to say problem, I like to say challenge. It brings up the whole challenge of how do you give credit for collaborative research. I don't know, Therèsa, you might have some comment about this.
Well, I think that right now it kind of depends on what discipline you're in. Interdisciplinarianism is and multidisciplinarianism is very big right now at my university, in my department, probably in my college, which is College of Arts and Letters. And so that they're looking for places that we intersect. What is interesting is dress studies, as all of us know, intersects with a lot of disciplines. And so when you're asked to extend yourself into more disciplines when you're already crisscrossing into them, collaborations can get so big that nothing gets done quickly. And that is the opposite side of what you're talking about, right? Where if you produce something and it gets out there, it gets published or it gets in an exhibit or something, then you have this who gets credit and how is that given merit at different universities and different departments. But the other side of that is collaborations are usually amazing when they're done, but the time that you put into them can be more because you have to run it by all your collaborators and you have to get okays on things. So those years that look like you're fallow and not working, that's difficult to communicate in annual reviews to administrators. So I think that if collaboration is encouraged, then there has to be compensation for the time it takes to produce something and merit for everybody that's involved on some level. That's just my own sense.
No, I think that's right. I wouldn't, you've taken it off, and expanded on what I've said. I think that's great.
What do you think about decolonization? I was involved this summer in a conference in Africa, South Africa, and it came up a lot about decolonizing fashion. In fact, there's a group called Fashion Decolonizers or Decolonizing Fashion, something like that. I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure on the title, but we are starting to see that crop up in all kinds of disciplines. And I think it's kind of interesting in dress. I'm not saying fashion here if people want to draw their distinctions, but I think that's an interesting conversation in dress because I feel like you were on the forefront of that long time before people even knew that word.
Well, from what I understand, see, these decolonization conferences have been in the past few years, and I haven't had the chance to attend any one of them, although I've kept up as I could with, some of the publications that have come out, the reports and so on. One of the things that I think is unusual for me is that, taking it back to my own experience with my research with the Kalabari, they put their own stamp on what they did with how they dressed, with borrowing what they wanted, but then changing it so much. We could go off into the whole dress of the women and what they called the iriabo and the stages and so on. And even though they would use things, as you see with the woman dancing, she has, what you might think is an American type or European, whatever kind of blouse. But the fact that she uses it with a wrapper, that she's made a mini wrapper style, it's really no longer European. And so decolonization to me doesn't work with the Kalabari as one example, because even though their country was colonized, they didn't really take on the colonized clothing. I think at one point, and I've never made anything about this, I just guess I accept it. At one point, I think the missionary influence did make them cover their breasts. But now women covering their breasts across the world, unless they go to nudist camps or something, or the nudist beach. But that no longer really seems to be colonization. It seems to be kind of a acceptable way of a woman wearing her outfit, you know? So I think that I've followed, you know, what's been happening with these colonization conferences, but my own research experience hasn't given me much to write about because I see the Kalabari as not really fitting into looking at decolonization.
Mm-hmm. Sandy Evenson wrote, one big change we are making to the visible self is to begin the 5th edition with the body, which, by the way, yay, that's where I started. Please talk about how and why we decided to make that change.
Oh, good question, Sandy. Yes, instead of starting with dressing the body, we decided the body is the base that you're dressing. And so it's the base in terms of looking at the classification system, because the two parts of the classification system are body modifications. What do you do to the body? And body supplements. What do you put on the body? So when you look at body modifications, and when we look at the world today, I mentioned these just quickly in passing, but when we look at how many, especially if we look just at the United States, being very specific right now, the popularity of piercings, the popularity of tattoos, you know, that is a really critical part, and they happen on the body. So that's why putting the body first for body modifications is important. And then if we look at the classification system and you look at body supplements, there's such a wide variety of things that supplement the body that really go past clothing. You know, if you use clothing to include shoes, some people would just call that footwear, you know, and not really clothing. But if you look at jewelry, and then you look at all the types of jewelry, and then you look at other accessories, and you look at headwear, that the range of supplements is also very wide, just like the range of modifications to the body is wide. So that that's why with the visible self, 5th edition, we decided to start with the body so that people realized, okay, it's the body is the armature for everything that we do to it and everything that we put on it. So great question, Sandy. Thanks for asking that and highlighting why we're doing that with the next edition.
And I would say that the body, the work that you've done in developing the concept of dress and the theory of dress, especially the classification system, is decolonized because it doesn't preference Western dress. It doesn't preference what would be considered colonizers. And that allows us to talk about anybody's dress anywhere in a more objective, if we could say that, a more almost scientific way that starts to remove some of the what's in trend and what's in fashion and who wore what and how did that come to be. Joe Jenkinson says, hello, Joanne. I'm interested in your early work with adolescents and teenagers. Did any of your research in Africa focus on young people's experience of dress?
Well, I love that question because when I first started going back to the Kalabari area, and I've never really even written a footnote about this, there were young people who were wearing Western dress because they were going to school and so forth. And, you know, they wear uniforms to school. And I wasn't very interested because I was so captivated by the other cultural aspects of dress, the other cultural examples, and so on. So I never really documented much of that. So I do have one great picture that I often use in a contrast slide set, pair of slides, of a young man who was helping me in the Kalabari area with my research, and he happened to be a masquerader, but on a daily basis he would wear jeans and t-shirts or a white shirt, and I have a picture of him that I really enjoy that he let me take, where he's got on a white shirt and jeans that are all ripped and have holes, just like are so fashionable here, and a leather belt that has a big buckle that says Texas, which he probably got either maybe a relative had traveled there and come back, or maybe he got it at a flea market or, you know, secondhand stall someplace in Nigeria because they're very common. And I often pair that with a picture of him as a masquerader where he's completely um, dressed as a masquerader. You can't see his facial identity or anything. And so show that here in that particular pairing, show that here is a contemporary guy, you know, that was somewhere in the 90s, but he also dresses in this very celebratory masquerade outfit. And that I usually finished a lecture with that because even though I wasn't emphasizing the everyday dress, which is the question of young people, which is the question in the chat, I wanted at the end of my lecture to emphasize the fact that even though I was interested in the cultural dress, that these people were part of everyday life in the global world. And a matching set of slides that I also used, usually at the end of the lecture, similarly was with a businessman, a very, very successful businessman, Kalabari businessman. And he gave me a picture of himself in which he's wearing a very handsome custom tailored suit. He told me it was that he had all of his suits custom tailored in Paris and London. And so there's this picture of him in this custom tailored suit, and he's sitting. You can see his Rolex watch, and he's holding a walking stick because that's what Kalabari gentlemen do. They use a walking stick not because they need it for support, but because it's a sign that they're a gentleman. And then I pair it with another photograph that he gave me, and he's wearing one of these velvet gowns, just like the gown that you see on the right, and he's wearing one of those amazing headpieces called an ajibulu that's made of feathers and many other trinkets. And that was his photograph when he became installed as a chief. And so I like to use those two pairs of photographs to indicate that these are everyday people with everyday lives, professions, whatever, even though they're so involved in their celebratory lives as Kalabari and the things that the acts, you know, the events that I was emphasizing more in my research. So the short answer is no, I really didn't follow up in terms of just documenting like teenage dress, but teenagers there, like teenagers here, pretty much were dressed in kind of the global outfit of jeans and t-shirts and so on, both boys and girls. And sometimes jeans for girls weren't quite as much approved as jeans for boys. I had a couple people comment on that.
I have a comment and then a question from an old friend. Emily, I apologize if I destroy anyone's name. Sam Maluski said she's very excited for the updates to the Visible South, and thank you, Joanne and Sandy. And then Susan Sokolowski, I'm sorry.
Sokolowski.
Thank you. Hi, Joanne. I'm joining today with Suzanne Suskis. Tell us about a research topic that you always wanted to work on and haven't had the bandwidth to address.
Oh my goodness.
I know that's a big question.
Yeah, that takes a little bit of thought. I don't know. I think I've been so involved in what I'm doing. The research questions that I've been interested in kind of just develop. And then I often say to somebody else, you know, why don't you do this?
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what do you think about cultural appropriation versus cultural authentication?
Well, yeah, maybe that's an answer to the question that was just raised. I think that cultural appropriation is a little overdone. I think what real cultural appropriation is stealing. It's if you just plain use something, you don't acknowledge it, it has no change, it's just whatever it came from, then you can call it cultural appropriation, but it's, you know, you're not doing anything to make it any different. The thing that's cultural authentication is just like the both slides in front of you, actually, because the Indian Madras is no longer really just Indian Madras. It has a whole different batch of motifs. It's completely different than just a plain Indian Madras that came from India. The same thing with the embroidered robe. Hazel Lutz, when she did her research on the embroidered velvets, actually did a really depth analysis of how the fact that the Kalabari started using the embroidered velvets from India that had been used for animal trappings and for wall hangings and so on, because of the way they used them. If you look at the woman's wrapper, they started having the fringe always be, they would order it so the fringe would be at the bottom, so it would make an accent for that particular wrapper. And then if you could see some of the other examples of both wrappers and robes, they asked to have the motifs that were embroidered in different positions on the edges and so on than they had been in India. And so, yes, they were borrowing, but they were changing so that it was an enhancement of how the way was that a woman wore her wrapper, or the way a man enhanced his build in terms of how the motifs of the embroidered units on the velvet lay. So when they change it that much, it's no longer just appropriation, it's creative changing to make it their own. And that's why Tony Arcasima actually thought of the phrase first of cultural authentication. And that's why they've authenticated it. They've really made it their own. Or look at that hat on the man. That actually it's kind of a bicorn shape that came from some of the English sea types of hats. But by the time they put feathers on it, sometimes they put little mirrors, they put, even though very creatively go out and buy other kinds of trinkets like um, hair barrettes and so on, but they pick them up for the glitter, the shape, the color and so on, and they place all of these things. And then if you look very carefully, there's something that looks like a target shape toward the back, and that's in Kalabari, it's called biaba. And that hat always has to have a biaba on it, as well as the feathers. And so it's no longer the bicorn military naval shaped hat that the basic hat is, but it's no longer the same hat. It's been culturally authenticated.
Yeah, I sometimes have students ask me, because I'm Native American, how I feel about people wearing Native American costumes at Halloween. And I say that I don't see it as cultural authentication if it's a costume, especially if a child is wearing it. But if it's disrespectful or being worn inappropriately, it definitely begins to cause trouble. And that's where we start to get into cultural authentication, or sorry, cultural appropriation. I have a question for you, Joanne, from Linda B. What area or aspect of dress history do you think needs to be given more attention?
Well, I think the paths that we've begun with several people, and that is looking at dress histories across the world, moving from looking at dress history of Western fashion to looking as much as possible to the dress histories of other cultures. Some of those are hard because of the time the cameras entered, and so we can only go as far as when we were able to take photographs, or we can do oral history, but oral history is sometimes quite amazing in terms of what has been passed down through people's memories and then being passed on with stories and so on. But I would say that I don't have any thoughts right now about particular items, or I don't know, maybe it would be same within Western groups. What are the dress histories of some particular subgroups that we may not have thought too much about? I think some people are starting to look back a little more at hippie and document some of it. We have some generalizations and stereotypes sometimes, but I don't know how thorough the dress histories are. So it might be that a short answer would be to look more at subcultures as well, cultures across the world, and then subcultures within the US and Europe.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank you, Joanne, for sharing this your oral history with us today. Again, we're going to say thank you from CSA and Joanne and I, and we hope that everybody has. Oh, we have some really great comments. I know that these are going to be forwarded to us from the CSA, but Judy Flynn says that it was an inspiring conversation. And apparently some of my students are on here. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. We miss seeing everybody in real life.
Well, if you want one last comment from me, I've noticed on the other interviews with early members of the Costume Society that usually the question is, what do you particularly like about being a member of the Costume Society? And so I think one of the things I would like to say is I've liked the variety of the types of people who belong, that we do have a lot of curators. Curators were some of those who started the who started CSA, we have academics, we have theater people, we have collectors. And I think one of the joys of CSA has been having such a wide range of people who are members and what they've brought when I meet them at meetings and when I've gone on some of the field trips and so on. So that's been one of the joys of CSA for me.
I just love the diverse people that are at the conferences at CSA and involved. It's just amazing. Thank you so much. There's so many wonderful comments in the chat, but I know that we're running out of time. So I just want to say thank you to everyone.